She didn't wear the uniform to prove anything, just black PT shorts, an old army shirt, and a duffel slung over one shoulder. But the admin officer took one look and said, "You can't wear that, not unless you're active duty," ordering her to change or leave the base. And when she turned to go, the back of her shirt lifted, just enough for someone across the room to see the tattoo on her upper back. And then they froze. Because that ink didn't come from a beach parlor or a flair for symbols. It came from a mission that never made the news, but changed the life of someone still in command. Want to know what the tattoo meant and why everything changed after that? Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The New Mexico sun had barely crested the horizon when Dana Carver pulled her weathered Tacoma through the gates of Fort Ridgeline. The air tasted of dust and diesel fumes, that familiar cocktail every soldier knows by heart. Heat waves already shimmered off the asphalt, and the distant hum of generators mixed with the morning chatter of boots on concrete. A convoy of supply trucks rumbled past the guardhouse, their engines adding to the symphony of military efficiency that never really slept. She cut the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. The parking lot stretched ahead of her, half empty, except for a cluster of government vehicles near the admin building. Through her windshield, she could see the track field, where young recruits were already gathering, their voices carrying on the dry wind like echoes of her own past. Some were stretching, others checking their laces with the nervous energy of soldiers about to be tested. Dana checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. 46 years old. Gray, threading through brown hair pulled back tight. Lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she'd first earned those 3 numbers on her back. But her posture was still straight, her hands still steady. Dan stepped out, slowly, methodically. Her movements had that deliberate quality that comes from years of making every motion count. She wore a faded Army PT uniform, gray shirt soft from countless washes, black shorts that had seen better days. The fabric held the ghost of old creases pressed sharp in another life when appearances mattered to promotion boards and inspection teams. The nameplate was gone, leaving only faint impressions in the fabric where Carver had once been stitched in black thread. Her dog tags barely glinted beneath the collar, hanging on a chain she'd never taken off, not once in 23 years. To anyone watching, she looked like just another retiree trying to hold on to something that used to define her. Maybe someone who missed the structure, the purpose, the simple clarity of knowing your mission and executing it without question. But Dana wasn't here to make a statement. She was here because Sergeant Major Dean had called 3 weeks ago, his voice rough with age and too many desert deployments, asking if she'd pace the female recruits during their annual evaluation. Need someone who knows what it means to push through when everything's falling apart, he'd said, his words carrying weight beyond their surface meaning. Someone who's been there. Dana had said yes before he'd finished asking. Not because she missed the Army, though some days she did with an ache that settled deep in her chest, but because she remembered being 19 and scared, running beside women who'd already proven themselves, learning what strength looked like when it wasn't performed for an audience. She checked her gear one final time. Water bottle, car keys, the folded authorization papers that should have made this simple. In her duffel, wrapped carefully in an old t-shirt, was something else. A photograph from 2000, 5 soldiers grinning at the camera, outside a forward operating base that no longer existed. 4 of those faces would never age past that moment. The base admin building loomed ahead, all concrete and bureaucracy. Dana pushed through the heavy glass doors into a wall of refrigerated air that made her skin prickle after the desert heat. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over beige walls covered in safety posters and outdated announcements. A faded banner proclaimed "Excellence in all we do" above a bulletin board cluttered with duty rosters and training schedules. The floor was that industrial linoleum that every government building seemed to share, polished to a dull shine by decades of boots. Behind the front counter, a young specialist named Morrison looked up from his computer screen, his expression shifting from boredom to mild confusion. He had the soft look of someone who'd never seen combat, never felt that particular weight that settled on your shoulders after you'd been shot at and returned fire. The nameplate on his desk read SPC Morrison J in crisp block letters. "Morning, ma'am. Can I help you?" Donna approached the counter with quiet confidence, her boots making soft sounds on the polished floor. She pulled folded papers from her jacket pocket, each crease precise and deliberate. "Dana Carver. I'm here for the training support. Should be on your volunteer roster." Morrison took the papers, scanning them with the kind of half attention that spoke of too many routine requests. Behind him, two civilian staffers were sorting files, their conversation a low murmur punctuated by occasional laughter. Coffee percolated in a corner machine, filling the air with that burnt smell of government brew that had been sitting too long on the burner. Morrison frowned at the screen. "I'm showing a D. Carver on the list, but..." He looked up at her PT uniform, then back at the papers. "Ma'am, I don't think that uniform is authorized unless you're currently assigned to the base." One of the staffers, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, glanced over. "Policy's pretty clear on that," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Can't have people wandering around in uniform pieces just because they used to serve." Her colleague nodded. "You'd think folks would know better. Playing dress-up doesn't make you active duty again." Dana's expression didn't change. She stood there, patient as stone, while Morrison clicked through more screens. The smell of burnt coffee drifted from a corner machine, mixing with the antiseptic scent of government-issue floor cleaner. "I'll need to check with a supervisor," Morrison finally said, disappearing into a side office. Minutes ticked by. Through the windows, Dana could see the recruits beginning their warm-up stretches, their young bodies moving with the eager awkwardness of soldiers, still learning their own strength. A few glanced toward the admin building, curiosity flickering across their faces. When Morrison returned, he brought company. Lieutenant Callan strode out of the office like he was already solving a problem that hadn't been properly explained to him. Early 30s, pressed uniform, the kind of confidence that hadn't been tested by anything harder than training scenarios. His boots were polished to mirror perfection, his uniform creases sharp enough to cut paper. He carried himself with the authority of rank, but lacked the worn edges that came from using it under fire. "Ms. Carver," he extended a hand with practiced courtesy, the kind they taught in officer candidate school. "I understand there's some confusion about your participation today." Dana shook his hand once firmly. Her grip was calloused, strong in a way that surprised him. "Sergeant First Class Dana Carver, retired. I'm cleared to support the evaluation." Callan glanced at the paperwork she'd submitted, his eyes scanning the lines with the methodical precision of someone who trusted regulations more than instinct. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the lieutenant bars on his collar, casting small shadows across his name tape. "This is more of a recommendation than an actual order," he said, his tone taking on that particular quality officers used when they wanted to sound reasonable while being inflexible. And Regulation AR 6701 is pretty specific about uniform wear. The PT uniform is for active duty personnel conducting official duties. He gestured to Morrison, who held up a folded base t-shirt in a plastic bag. Generic. Civilian. Safe. The shirt was navy blue, with Fort Ridgeline printed in block letters across the chest. "We'd be happy to have you out there in appropriate attire," Callan continued, his smile never wavering. "Otherwise, I'm afraid base policy requires..." He let the sentence hang, his tone still polite, but with steel underneath. Donna looked at the offered shirt, then back at Callan. She didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't defend her right to be there. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, filled only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of recruits calling cadence outside. She simply nodded, bent to retrieve her duffel bag from where she'd set it beside the counter, and turned toward the door. That's when it happened. As she leaned forward, her PT shirt rode up slightly, exposing the skin between her shoulder blades. The fabric pulled tight across her back, revealing what lay beneath. There, etched in stark black ink against sun-weathered skin, were three numbers that made the air in the room suddenly feel thinner. 13, 7, 5. The tattoo wasn't decorative. It wasn't memorial art or some motivational phrase in flowing script. It was just numbers, angular and precise, burned into skin like a brand. The ink had faded slightly over the years, but the lines remained sharp, uncompromising. Below the numbers, barely visible, was a smaller symbol, a stylized owl with its wings spread, perched above crossed swords. Morrison didn't notice. He was already turning back to his computer, the morning's excitement over. Callan was adjusting his uniform, satisfied that policy had been maintained. But Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, walking past the hallway with a maintenance clipboard tucked under his arm, stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked onto those numbers, and his face went pale. The clipboard slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering on the linoleum floor. Rodriguez had seen that tattoo before. In classified briefings he wasn't supposed to remember. On after-action reports that technically didn't exist. He'd been a young corporal then, assigned to intelligence analysis, tasked with reading between heavily redacted lines. Most of the reports had been boring, routine, but some had kept him awake at night. Detachment 137-5, Night Owl Group, the unit that held the Northern Gate fallback route when everything went to hell. The unit that saved a NATO convoy by fighting alone for 43 minutes against impossible odds. The unit that was disbanded and erased from official records because what they'd done was too classified to acknowledge, too sensitive to celebrate, too dangerous to remember officially. Rodriguez watched Dana walk toward the exit, her movements still calm, still measured. His throat felt dry. He should say something. Should tell them who she really was. Instead, he turned and walked quickly toward the back offices, his clipboard forgotten, his mind racing toward a phone call he probably shouldn't make, but absolutely had to. Outside, Dana found a spot on the bleachers near the track. She set down her duffel and watched the recruits go through their paces. The sun climbed higher, painting everything in shades of brass and shadow. The young soldiers moved with energy and purpose, their voices carrying on the desert wind. She didn't sulk, didn't fume, just sat there, patient as the desert itself, watching the next generation prepare for challenges they couldn't yet imagine. A breeze caught her shirt, lifting it slightly. The tattoo remained visible. 3 numbers that told a story most people would never know. But Dana had learned long ago that recognition wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned, one quiet moment at a time. In the admin building, Rodriguez had found an empty office marked Communications, Authorized Personnel Only, and locked the door behind him. His hands shook slightly as he dialed a number he'd memorized but never used, a number from a briefing packet that had been burned after reading. The office smelled of stale coffee and old paper, with a single window that looked out over the motor pool where mechanics were already working under the climbing sun. It rang twice before a crisp voice answered. No identification, no greeting. Command liaison. Rodriguez swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Sir, this is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez at Fort Ridgeline. I need to report situation involving a possible classified personnel identification. A pause that stretched longer than heartbeats. In the background, Rodriguez could hear the faint sound of keyboards clicking, the distant murmur of serious voices handling serious business. Go ahead, Sergeant. This line is secure. We have a volunteer here, retired, female. She's got ink that... Rodriguez swallowed hard, thinking of the briefings, the redacted files, the whispered stories. Sir, she's got Detachment 1375 marked on her, clear as day, with the owl insignia. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Rodriguez could almost hear gears turning, databases being accessed, decisions being weighed at levels far above his pay grade. Are you certain of the identification, Sergeant? Yes, sir. Dead certain. I've seen those marks in classified materials. This isn't some wannabe with internet research. Understood. What's her current status with base personnel? They just asked her to leave. Uniform violation. Some lieutenant thinks she's playing dress up. Another pause. Longer this time. Rodriguez heard papers shuffling, urgent whispers in the background. Sergeant Rodriguez, you will immediately inform your commanding officer that this individual is to be treated with full courtesy and given any assistance she requires. This comes from levels you don't need to know about. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Absolutely. And Rodriguez? Sir? This conversation never happened, but if anyone disrespects that woman again, they'll answer to people who don't wear name tapes. The line went dead with a finality that made Rodriguez's hands shake as he replaced the receiver. 10 minutes later, Major Ronson emerged from the admin building like a man on a mission. He was Fort Ridgeline's training officer, a man who'd seen enough combat to know the difference between paperwork warriors and the real thing. His uniform was crisp, but his boots were scuffed, and he carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. He found Lieutenant Callan still at the front desk, sorting through volunteer paperwork with the satisfied air of a problem solver. Lieutenant, Ronson's voice cut through the ambient chatter. I understand we've had an issue with volunteer authorization? Callan straightened. Yes, sir. Uniform regulation compliance. I handled it appropriately. Ronson placed a printed document on the counter. The header read, Service Verification, Sergeant First Class Dana Carver, Special Clearance for Training Support Activities, valid through end of quarter. This was in your inbox since Tuesday, Ronson said quietly. Why wasn't it processed? Callan's face went through several shades of pale. Sir, There's a lot of paperwork. You must have failed to do your job properly. Ronson's voice remained level, but there was permafrost underneath, which means you questioned the authorization of a decorated veteran because you couldn't be bothered to read your email. Through the window, they could see Dana still sitting on the bleachers, her posture unchanged, her attention focused on the recruits. Ronson folded the document and tucked it into his pocket. I'm gonna fix this. And Lieutenant... Yes, sir. Next time you think about playing uniform police with someone you don't know, maybe ask yourself if you're qualified to make that judgment call. Ronson headed for the door, leaving Callan standing there with the slow, sick realization that he'd just made the kind of mistake that follows you through your entire career. Dana saw him coming before he reached the bleachers. Colonel Ford moved like water, smooth and inevitable. He was Fort Ridgeline's commanding officer, a man whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through close-cropped hair and the kind of bearing that spoke of decisions made under fire. His uniform was crisp but lived in, with ribbons that told stories of deployments to places that didn't make the news. When he stopped 6 feet from where she sat, his hands clasped behind his back, Dana didn't stand. Just looked up with those same steady eyes that had stared down enemy fire, that had watched good soldiers take their last breaths, that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. The recruits on the track had noticed the colonel's approach. Their conversations quieted, heads turning to watch this unexpected encounter. Even at a distance, they could sense something significant was about to happen. Sergeant Carver, Ford said, his voice carrying just far enough for the admin building to hear. Each word was deliberate, weighted with authority and something deeper. That ink on your back, where'd you earn it? Dana's posture didn't change, only her voice moved, quiet but clear, cutting through the desert air like a blade. Northern Gate, April 2000, NATO fallback route. I was rear fire team. Ford nodded once, slowly. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment his eyes held the distant look of someone remembering friends who didn't come home. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice to something meant, just for her, intimate as a confession. My brother was convoy security that day. Private First Class Nathan Ford. You pulled him out after the second IED, held the flank when everyone else fell back. Dana's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A shadow crossed her face, memory surfacing like debris after an explosion. Didn't know who was in the lead truck. Didn't matter. Ford studied her face for a moment, seeing something there that most people missed. Pain, carefully controlled, grief that had been locked away because there had been no time to process it, no luxury of mourning. The weight of survivors who carried the names of the dead like stones in their pockets. He made it home because of you, Ford said quietly. Lived another 16 years, got married, had kids, died peacefully in his sleep last winter. Dana's breath caught just for an instant. Good, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's good. Then he did something that made the entire base take notice. He brought his hand up in a sharp, formal salute. Right there, on the edge of the track, in full view of every junior officer, every enlisted soldier, every recruit who happened to be looking their way. The base commander, saluting a woman in a faded PT uniform, with no visible rank and dust on her sleeves. The gesture cut through the desert air like a blade. Conversations stopped, heads turned. Even the recruits paused mid-stretch to stare. Ford held the salute, longer than regulation required, then dropped it with the same precision. If Sergeant Carver wants to wear that uniform, he said, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet, she wears it. If she wants to support our training, she supports it. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can come explain it to me personally. He turned toward the admin building, where Lieutenant Callan stood visible through the glass doors, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Policy, Ford continued, serves the mission, not the other way around. Then, back to Dana, his tone warming slightly. If you'll walk with me, Sergeant, I'd like to make this right. Dana rose, shouldering her duffel with practiced ease. Lead the way, sir. They walked back toward the admin building together, not as commander and subordinate, but as peers, as professionals, as soldiers who understood that respect isn't given, it's earned, one moment of integrity at a time. Inside the air-conditioned silence of Ford's office, with the blinds drawn and the door closed, the conversation that followed was brief and quiet. Ford pulled up files on his computer, scrolled through pages that most people didn't have clearance to see. Detachment 1375, he said without looking up. Night Owl Group, disbanded after the Northern Gate action, classified records, redacted reports, heroes who officially never existed. Dana sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. That was the idea. You saved 17 NATO personnel that day, held a defensive position for 43 minutes with no support, no resupply, no backup. Someone had to. Ford finally looked at her. You were awarded a Bronze Star. It's sitting in a classified file that 3 people in the Pentagon have access to. Don't need a medal, Dana said quietly. The ones who mattered made it home. That's enough. Ford printed a single sheet of paper, signed it with his own authorization code, and handed it across the desk. Updated clearance. You want to train with our people, you train with them. Whatever uniform you're comfortable wearing. Dana folded the paper once, precisely, and tucked it into her duffel. Appreciate it, sir. They walked out together, past the same staffers who'd made jokes about playing dress-up, past the same specialists who'd questioned her authorization. This time nobody spoke. Some stood, others found urgent business elsewhere. On the track, the recruits had finished their warm-ups and were gathering for the main event. Young faces, eager and nervous, looking toward their future with the kind of hope that hadn't been tested yet. Ford addressed the training NCO overseeing the formation. Sergeant Carver will be pacing today's run. She's cleared for whatever uniform components she's wearing. Effective immediately. The NCO nodded sharply. Yes, sir. Ford's voice carried as he spoke to the assembled officers. New policy, effective today. Prior service veterans supporting official training events are authorized appropriate uniform elements at command discretion. Questions about that discretion come to me. Lieutenant Callan, who had emerged from the admin building looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour, stepped forward. Sergeant Carver, I want to apologize. I didn't understand. Dana raised a hand, gently stopping him. You didn't ask! The recruits were watching now, sensing something important was happening, even if they didn't understand exactly what. Whispers rippled through the formation. That's her! The one who... Did you see the colonel salute? Dana didn't wait for more ceremony. She dropped her duffel beside the bleachers, stretched once, and jogged out to the track with the kind of easy grace that comes from muscle memory. When the formation started moving, she wasn't just keeping pace, she was setting it. Her stride was smooth, controlled, efficient. The younger soldiers behind her found themselves working harder than expected just to stay close. Her breathing remained steady while theirs began to labor. Her posture stayed upright while theirs started to falter. By the second lap, nobody was questioning what she was doing there. By the third, they were trying to learn from it. Colonel Ford remained at trackside, arms folded, watching the formation pass. His training NCO leaned over slightly. Sir, think she's gonna let them catch her? Ford's eyes followed Dana's steady rhythm, noting the way she seemed to glide while the recruits worked twice as hard for the same speed. Only if she wants to, he said quietly. The run ended with Dana barely breathing hard while half the formation bent over their knees, gasping in the desert heat. She'd paced them perfectly, fast enough to challenge, controlled enough to build their confidence. Professional to the core. As the recruits dispersed toward showers and lunch, Dana found herself sitting on the concrete steps outside the motor pool, watching the bass settle into its midday rhythm. The sun was higher now, painting everything in shades of brass and amber. The heat shimmered off the asphalt in waves, and somewhere in the distance a helicopter was running maintenance checks, its rotors creating a rhythmic thump that carried on the desert wind. A young private approached hesitantly, clutching a water bottle like a lifeline. Maybe 19 years old, with the kind of earnest determination that reminded Dana of herself at that age. Her uniform was still crisp, her boots still held their shine, and her movements carried that careful precision of someone still learning how to be a soldier. Ma'am, the girl began, her voice barely above a whisper, if it's okay to ask, were you really with Night Owl? Dana looked up, her expression gentle but guarded. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. I was. The private stepped closer, glancing around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. Her voice dropped even lower. My cousin's National Guard, served in Afghanistan. He said there were stories about that unit, about what happened at the Northern Gate. But he thought it was just classified rumors, ghost stories that officers told to scare new recruits. It was classified, Dana replied, her voice carrying the weight of years spent keeping secrets. Supposed to stay that way. The young soldier's eyes widened. Did you really hold the position alone? Against a full company? Dana was quiet for a moment, looking out across the base toward the distant mountains. The peaks shimmered in the heat, ancient and unchanging, indifferent to the small, human dramas played out in their shadow. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, like someone sharing a truth too heavy for one person to carry alone. Not alone. Never alone. But the others. She paused, her throat working as if the words were difficult to swallow. The others didn't make it back. The young soldier's face fell, her expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper. Respect. Understanding that some questions shouldn't be asked. Some stories shouldn't be pressed for. I'm sorry, she whispered. Dana shook her head slightly, the gesture both dismissive and protective. They didn't need pity. They needed time. When they ran out of time, they gave me mine. They gave everyone theirs. The private stood there, struggling with something bigger than she had words for. Her water bottle trembled slightly in her hands. Finally, she asked the question that had been building since she'd watched Dana pace the formation with effortless grace. Why'd you come back? After everything? After what they took from you? Dana stood slowly, brushing dust from her hands with movements that were precise, deliberate. She looked at the young soldier with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was warmer than stone, older than the desert around them. Because someone's got to show you what quiet strength looks like, what it means to serve without needing recognition, what it costs to carry that weight, and why it's worth carrying anyway. She paused, her eyes taking in the base around them, the young soldiers going about their duties, the flag snapping in the desert wind. You're going to face things out there that the manuals don't cover. Times when the chain of command breaks down, when the mission goes sideways, when good people are depending on you to make impossible choices. Her voice remained steady, matter of fact. When that happens, you'll remember that quiet strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the one still standing when the noise stops. She walked to her truck, the same weathered Tacoma that had carried her through civilian life, now somehow different than it had been that morning. As she climbed in and started the engine, the recruits who'd run behind her were gathered near the barracks, still talking about the woman who'd made their best pace look effortless. Dana pulled away down the gravel road that wound behind the base, past the motor pool and the training fields and the endless expanse of desert beyond. In her rearview mirror, Fort Ridgeline grew smaller, but somehow more solid, like something important had been settled there. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her right to be there. And the next time someone mentioned Detachment 13 to 75, it wouldn't be in whispered rumors or classified files. It would be in the respectful silence of people who finally understood what real service looked like. Have you ever seen someone quietly hold their ground while others mocked them? Share this story with someone who knows what quiet strength really means. Hit that subscribe button if you believe veterans deserve respect, not just on holidays, but every single day they walk among us.